get there. First of all, where is that tenor? Terry, there he is. I know you're feeling better, and we look forward to getting you back up here so that the choir can have their tenor again. I have visuals this morning, and my son, Chad, and his girlfriend, Andrea, who work in the technology industry, are here this morning, and if this doesn't work out, if you can jump up there and help me out at some point, I would appreciate that. It's going to be a lot of fun. The son turned the age when he could get his driver's license, and he went to his father and said, "Dad, you know, now that I got my license, I'd like to be able to get my own car. Can you help me out?" And the father says, "You know, that's a good idea, but let me do this. Over the next semester, if you get your grades up, if you read your Bible, and you get your hair cut, then we can talk about you getting that new car." So over the semester, at the end, the son went back to the father and says, "Well, how did I do?" And he says, "You know, I was impressed. You did get your grades up, you did read your Bible, but you didn't get your hair cut." And the son says, "You know, funny you should mention that. I was reading in the Bible about all these great people. There was Moses, and there was Joseph, and there was Samson, and there was Jesus, and they all had long hair." And without missing a beat, the father said, "And did you notice how they walked everywhere they went?" A few weeks ago, when Cindy and I were in the parlor here, we were going through some of the books that were on the shelf, have been there for years. We were trying to see which ones we would migrate to our new Stemple Memorial Library, and I was reacquainted with an old friend. I didn't know it was there. This is volume 6 of a 10-volume series of children's Bible stories. We had this series on the shelf in my home that I grew up in. This was a highly influential series to me. When I opened the book right away, here were illustrations that took me right back to my childhood. I haven't seen these in centuries. And I had to admit to myself that this series of books had such a profound influence on me. This was how I grew up picturing God as a result of the illustrations in this book. This was how I came to understand the church and religion. And this was, for years, this was what I would call my Sunday school God. This helped me develop my Sunday school God and my vision of what it meant to be a Christian. I grew up in the Methodist church in Los Angeles. My parents and I were all very active in that church, and I did a lot of things. I was in all the youth groups. I taught Sunday school, but don't get any bright ideas. I was a youth group counselor. I sang in the choirs, on committees. Before Cindy and I moved to the East Coast, we were in charge of the coffee hour, just like the Doughertys are here in Hillsdale. And when we came here more than 20 years ago, we became very active. And through all that time, I was able to rely on my Sunday school God. Until 9/11. That changed everything, as it did for many of us who lived through that in this area. I'm an anchor on CNBC, and I had to anchor many hours that day of our coverage. So I was confronted by the horrors minute by minute that day, and I turned to God for comfort and understanding. And to my horror, I realized that my Sunday school God no longer met my very adult needs all of a sudden. Thankfully, at that time, our pastor at the time, Mark Earl, was offering a Disciple 1 Bible class. And I jumped at the opportunity. It was the first time I had ever read the Bible all the way through as an adult. And I'll do a commercial for Disciple one more time. We're offering it again this Tuesday night, starting this Tuesday night. Many of you have signed up, but if you haven't, you would be welcome to join us. In fact, I've got 2 people who are going to join us who have already taken Disciple 1 before, but they're going to do it again. You're able to read we meet Tuesday nights from 7:30 to 8:45. You're home by 9. And we are going to be able to offer nursery program for you. So that will be a part of the program as well. But when you read the Bible through, it's the good first step in developing that adult God. And when I finished Disciple, I read voraciously beyond that. I read books about God. I read books about church history. I read books about people who have had difficult journeys through faith. And what I came up with was the notion that faith is not easy. It doesn't just happen. You don't get faith just by showing up on Sunday morning. You have to work at it. And that is why I'm such a strong advocate of adult education in our church. And that is why I love to teach the Disciple Bible classes, because it is a wonderful program to help adults outgrow their Sunday school gods. So that's one step. But the process doesn't begin and end with the Bible. In order to develop a faith that serves you well as an adult, you must be open and receptive to new opportunities and stories and examples at all times. Not just when you're at church and not when you're reading the Bible. You never know where the next lesson or insight will come from. Our scripture reading this morning, let me get to it now, from Luke chapter 4, verses 14 through 22. This is Jesus. He's now beginning his ministry. He's an adult, and he's beginning his ministry. He's gone home to the Galilee region, to Nazareth, where he grew up, and he begins to teach. We're reading verses 14, and I'll stop at 22. Jesus, filled with the power of the Spirit, returned to Galilee, and a report about him spread through all the surrounding country. He began to teach in their synagogues and was praised by everyone. And when he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled it and found the place where it was written, and read, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." He rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him, and then he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. And they said, "Is not this Joseph's son?" The story goes on. Jesus then starts to preach, and he says things that they don't like to hear. He gave them hard truths, and they were enraged. And suddenly they're no longer able to hear him, because they're saying to themselves at the same time, "Wait a minute, this is the son of the local carpenter. Who is he to tell us these difficult things?" And they ran him out of town. It was a missed opportunity for both that congregation and for Jesus. But we have a wonderful opportunity to help us develop our faith here at Hillsdale. That's why I'm very excited about the Stemple Memorial Library. You'll hear more about it in a bit, but it is the beginning of an important new ministry for our church. And this morning I want to highlight 3 books that will be in our library about famous Christians who did amazing works as people of God, even though faith did not come easily to them. Each of them struggled mightily with their faith, and each of them approached faith in a very different way. One was very spiritual, one very much into serving others, and one was an intellectual. First, the spiritual. Wish me luck here. Hang on. All right. 1 second. I can keep going even if it doesn't work. Where's Brian? Oh, my battery is low, it says. Okay, what you don't see up there is a picture of Thomas Merton. Thomas Merton, when Pope Francis was here a couple weeks ago and he spoke to a joint session of Congress, he mentioned 3 American Catholics who led exemplary lives, and Thomas Merton was one of them. He's a handsome devil. You'd love to see him here. He was born in France in 1915, and both of his parents were artists. His father was an Anglican from New Zealand. His mother was an American who was a Quaker. Both Both of his parents died when he was young, so Thomas Merton split his time for years between Europe, where his relatives lives on his father's side, and his grandparents who lived here in Flushing, Queens. He went to Columbia University in New York and earned his bachelor's degree in English. When he was a very young man, Merton was a man about town. He was a partier. By his own admission, he was a ladies' man. And he traveled extensively throughout Europe. Religion did not play a role in his life until he took a particular trip to Rome. Now, he'd been to Rome before and he'd done all the touristy things. He saw the Forum and the Colosseum and all of the other ruins there. But on this particular trip, he toured some of the churches and cathedrals of Rome. And in one particular church, he came upon a mosaic of Jesus that just captivated him. It stirred something in him that he didn't initially understand, but it stirred him nonetheless profoundly. He found that he didn't want to leave this church. He couldn't leave. And that moment was the beginning of his lifelong journey with God. It's a long story, it's in the book, but Thomas Merton eventually went on to become a Trappist monk in Kentucky. The Trappists are known for their deep spirituality, their dedication to God, and their silence. The party animal became a monk. How ironic. Now, Thomas Merton wrote 70 books during his time in the monastery, and I was going to show you the most famous of them, but you'll see it in the library. It is his autobiography called The Seven-Story Mountain. It was published in 1948, and it became an instant bestseller when it was published. It has been called one of the 100 greatest nonfiction books of the 20th century. Not just about religion, but period. One of the 100 greatest books written in the 20th century. It is lyrically written. Merton was a poet at heart, and he wrote eloquently and inspirationally about what it is like to live a life of faith. In it, he said, and I quote, "Life is either all spiritual or not spiritual at all. No man can serve two masters. Your life is shaped by the end you lived for. You are made in the image of what you desire." One more time on that one. You are made in the image of what you desire. Next slide. Picture Mother Teresa up there. Everybody knows her. She was legendary for her service to the poorest of the poor in India. She was an Albanian born in 1910, and when she became a nun, initially, like Thomas Merton, she lived in a monastery. But the solitary life didn't suit her. She wanted to serve. So she left that monastery and went to India and founded the Missionaries of Charity, which today includes roughly 5,000 sisters who serve the poor in more than 100 countries. As you may remember, Mother Teresa won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1979 for her life of service, and there is little doubt that eventually the Catholic Church will name her a saint someday. Mother Teresa died in 1997, and 10 years later, a book was published. It's called Come Be My Light. It's a compilation of private letters that she wrote over a 50-year period, mostly to her personal father, confessor. The battery died, so we didn't get to show the pictures, but it's okay. In this book are the letters that she wrote to her personal father, confessor. The book made worldwide headlines when it came out because these letters, which, by the way, Mother Teresa asked be destroyed, but they weren't. They revealed a shocking truth about her. Early in her career in India, she suddenly stopped feeling the presence of God in her life. It was as if God had abandoned her. The priest who edited these letters in this book wrote that she ceased to feel Christ's presence in her heart and in the Eucharist when she took communion. In one letter, Mother Teresa shared her agony, and I quote, "I am told that God lives in me, and yet the reality of darkness and coldness and emptiness is so great that nothing touches my soul. There is nothing but emptiness and darkness." This is Mother Teresa writing this. There's a moment in the life of Jesus that became her touchstone. It is the moment that she returned to again and again. It is when Jesus is on the cross and he cries out to God, "Why have you forsaken me?" Mother Teresa kept asking the very same question for the rest of her life. But here's the remarkable part of that whole story for me. Now, despite this darkness and emptiness that she experienced for so many years, Mother Teresa carried on with her missionary work for decades. Even though she felt God had abandoned her personally, she continued to do what she saw as God's work. A remarkable story. And it's in our library. Last picture. C.S. Lewis, you know the name. He was born in Ireland in 1898. He was a classic British intellectual, a man of letters who taught at both Oxford and Cambridge. He was raised in the Anglican Church, but at the age of 15, C.S. Lewis declared himself an atheist. He was a logical thinker, after all, and God didn't fit into the way that he saw the world. Early in his teaching career, he wrote, "If God really designed the world, it would not be a world so frail and faulty as we see." Lewis was an atheist for almost 20 years of his life. His best friend throughout his life was J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of the Lord of the Rings trilogy and The Hobbit. The two men taught at Oxford together for many years. Tolkien was, as you probably know, a devout Catholic. And he spent hours arguing with his friend Lewis about God and faith. And eventually he prevailed. C.S. Lewis returned to God. Now Tolkien hoped that Lewis would become a Catholic, but instead Lewis went back to the Church of England. But it was an agonizing process for him. He writes in his book, Surprised by Joy it's called. It's a memoir of his early years as an atheist and his return to Christianity while he was teaching with Tolkien at Magdalen College in Oxford. Here's the quote from C.S. Lewis. "You must picture me alone in that room in Magdalen, night after night, feeling, whenever my mind lifted for a second from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach of Him whom I earnestly desired not to meet. That which I greatly feared had at last come upon me. I gave in and admitted that God was God, and I knelt and I prayed. Perhaps that night, the most dejected and reluctant convert in all of England." C.S. Lewis went on to become maybe the most prolific Christian writer of the 20th century. We have several of his books in the Stemple Library. In addition to Surprised by Joy, we have Mere Christianity. It's a series of essays that he wrote about Christian faith in the 1940s. Now, he read these essays during radio broadcasts during the darkest days of World War II in England. They were meant to inspire and comfort, and they did. And to me, Mere Christianity is a modern version of the letters the Apostle Paul wrote that make up most of our New Testament today. Paul wrote his letters as pep talks to the earliest Christians. They explain in detail what it meant to be a Christian. And that is exactly what the essays in Mere Christianity did for the people of England in World War II. Both Paul and C.S. Lewis are relevant to us today. In addition to Surprised by Joy and Mere Christianity, we also have his delightful work of fiction, The Screwtape Letters, which became a Broadway production that some of us got to see a few years ago. It's a long story. In The Screwtape Letters, the devil writes a series of letters to his nephew who is beginning his first mission on earth, trying to secure the soul of a young man who has just converted to Christianity. We have both the book, and I'm happy to say the audio version of that you could listen to if you want. And of course, we also have C.S. Lewis's masterpiece, The Chronicles of Narnia, the classic of children's literature that adults also read. It is a 7-volume allegory about the life of Christ. And I know a young man that read them when he was in the 6th grade at the time. Faith is not easy. These three people prove that. It is always a work in progress. You are doing yourself a terrible injustice if you don't keep working to develop your faith and instead continue to carry your Sunday school God throughout life with you. We begin our Disciple One Bible class Tuesday night. That would be a good first step. And now we have our wonderful Stemple Library where we can all continue to know God better. Let me just mention, the books I've mentioned this morning are all in the library. The three that I was going to highlight up here are on the first shelf that you walk in. Each Sunday that there are books mentioned, those books will be on the shelf. And the book that Pastor Brian has been using the last 2 weeks for his sermons, The Hard Sayings of Jesus, he has 2 more weeks of sermons from that book. We have 3 copies of that on the shelf as well, if you'd like to take that out of the library and begin your journey. Well, shall we dedicate the library?
Let's dedicate
All right.
the library. Yes. If I can have the family come forward.